Welcome to the Exponential Athlete. This is the fourth and final episode in my four-part series on Roger Federer. So in this episode, we're going to focus on the outside factors to Roger's success, things that he didn't necessarily have control over or didn't necessarily have perceived control over. First, we're going to talk about what a lot of people described as his natural advantages. So physically, psychologically, how he approached the game. Next, we're going to look at the approach that his parents took to raise him, which I think is a really good case study for any coaches or parents out there. Next, we'll talk a little bit about luck. So luck is a factor for all athletes. Where did that play into Roger's career? We'll also look at his psychology. So we described him as playful, as curious, as someone who was very difficult to keep stimulated all the time. These are all characteristics of ADHD. And I think that, again, I'm not a doctor by any stretch of the imagination, but I believe a lot of athletes, maybe a disproportionate number of athletes, have some of these symptoms. And I don't necessarily think that coaching takes these into consideration, or the school systems that we have take these into consideration when we're trying to raise kids to improve their performance or raise kids to enjoy a game more. So I'll dive a little bit into what that looks like. I'm, of course, going to bring in an expert eventually to talk more about what that means, but I thought that that was an interesting rabbit hole to go down as well. Finally, I'll touch on the pitfalls of Roger Federer's success. So obviously, I viewed Roger as having very few pitfalls in terms of how he treated his body, in terms of his balance between life and his sport, but there are obviously some things he could have improved upon or done better. And I think it's important to note those. There's nothing to say that if he had done things differently, he would have had more success on the court. There's a chance that he completely optimized what he did. But even with the greatest of all time, I think it's important to say, hey, could this have been iterated on? Could this have been improved? Because that is the mission of any of us, is to really pursue the pinnacle of the craft. And you can't do that without at least some feedback, not necessarily criticism, but without really diving in and evaluating those things. Let's jump straight in to natural ability. When it comes to tennis, I favor Martina Navratilovan's hybrid formula. Champions are born, and then they have the right environment to be made. No matter how sound the plan, how high the work rate, or how wealthy the parent, a player of modest height and below average hand-eye coordination and quickness is not going to be hoisting any Grand Slam trophies. So this is a huge debate in sports in general. So are athletes made or are they born? Martina believes that this is sort of a hybrid approach. I think that that's overarchingly the prevailing wisdom. But I also think that this varies dramatically between sports. So in a sport like basketball, where there's a massive premium on size, a sport like swimming, maybe even tennis, there's physical factors that are essentially minimum for you to be able to compete in these leagues. Of course, there are some outliers, like I think of Spud Webb, who is 5'4" or something along those lines. But those are by far the exception to the norm. On the other hand, I think there are other sports, golf is one in particular, that genetic factors play a smaller role. Obviously, there's a great book around this called The Sports Gene by David Epstein. I highly recommend reading that. He also wrote Range, which I talked about earlier in part 2 as well. Mark Rossett, the best Swiss men's player before Federer, moved the goalposts to a faraway place. He likes to talk about Federer's processing speed. Rossett remembers doing a drill which someone would throw 5 balls of different colors into the air and ask the players to catch 5 balls in order according to color. The maximum I ever did was 4, Rossett said. It was really tough for me. Raj, you gave him 5 balls and he caught all 5. But there's a talent we don't talk about enough, and that's reactivity, the ability of the brain to interpret what the eyes are seeing. When you look at the great champions, a football player like Zidane or Maradona, or you look at Federer, Djokovic, Nadal in tennis, you have the impression sometimes that they're in the Matrix, that everything is going so fast, too fast for you and me, but they pick up on things so quickly that it's as if they have more time for their brains to process it all. So my thought is always, can we create this with range? Maybe they do have some innate ability to pick up things quicker, but can we train this? You see a lot of quarterbacks, for example, doing drills with strobe lights and picking up and anticipating what's happening. You see baseball players who are able to hit a ball moving 100 miles per hour from 60 feet away. You have all these athletes that are able to do these incredible things. Of course, there's probably some natural ability, but how close with training, how close with trying different things and working on different stimuli can we get to this perceived ability to slow down time? I'm not all that convinced that it's necessarily innate. I would love to talk to a researcher around if they're doing analysis like this in kids and if there's a substantial difference between individual children and what that looks like over time. There's a chance maybe they have some of that research, and to me, that's really interesting. Roger's really good at mimicking things. Amazing, actually, said Steven Grovenfeld, the Dutchman who would work for him at the Swiss National Tennis Center. That's another skill that we don't necessarily think about, the ability to replicate, the ability to imitate. We look at Kobe, we look at a little bit at Tiger, we look at Roger, who was trying to replicate the people that came before him and then give their own spin on it. To me, this is something we don't talk about enough, is how important it is to be able to ape or to imitate what other great people are doing. Again, I don't know if this is necessarily innate or if it's something that can be developed over time. I would imagine practicing and, like what we talked about with the chess players, pattern matching to create this good memory, perhaps those are things that help you to do this more effectively. John Yandel, a tennis videographer and analyst, has discovered that Federer's backhand slice generates more spin, up to 90 revolutions per second, than any other shot in the sport, above even the forehands of Nadal and Federer. John McEnroe's analysis is that Federer's slice puts great uncertainty in an opponent's mind. He wants you to feel unsettled and not to know what's coming next. Federer's sliced backhand has been so effective, Tim Henman has said, because it enables him to change the pace of the rally. He can slow the point down and slice, and then, from out of nowhere, speed it up again with a flat or topspin ball. And that means he makes more impact with that next shot. So we didn't actually talk about the backhand slice in the technique part, because I'm always wondering, is this something that is more innate? Is this something that is developed? Now, because Federer plays a one-handed backhand, he probably is able to generate a dramatically better backhand slice than most of the other players. So is that a natural advantage or a strategic advantage? The fact that he can create this much spin compared to these other players, it's also likely a function of practice. But to me, this is an interesting part of his game to analyze, is that how does he create this unique shot that throws everyone else off? Again, I can't say that this is innate or if it was practiced, but at least it's perceived to be something that is God-given or something that is incredible by his peers. If I had to choose one person's physique for playing tennis, I'd choose Federer's. For every aspect, speed, coordination, stamina, you can see in the 5-set matches that he's played, he almost never ends up exhausted. The other player wastes much more energy than he does. That all adds up to a career like his. By now, he's won 1,000 matches and has never had a serious injury. Other players with many less have suffered much more. So again, I want to pose to you, how much of this is natural? There's a good chance that he does have really good physiology. There's a good chance his body is designed well. He has a great sense of balance and a great sense of his limitations, and he's adaptable. But over the course of 20 years, I don't think it's necessarily body construction that is the key to all of this. Perhaps if you compare him to a Nadal or to Mirka, his wife, who had foot issues, knee issues, and things along those lines that were structural, absolutely. But I don't necessarily know if his physiology, the way he was constructed, is as much given as a lot of people give it credit for. I really highlight on what people perceive as natural gifts, because I think most of them are a lot more mobile or a lot more mutable than what people are perceiving them to be. I do this section because I think it's important for us to challenge what people believe to be natural versus what we can create. And with advancements in technology, coaching, training, especially over a long period of time, I think we can minimize natural advantages as much as possible. Aside from height or some of these other things, I'm not going to be able to compete against someone who's 7 feet tall when I'm 5'9" on a good day. that would be in basketball or in some of these other sports where range or distance in those senses is very relevant. Let's dive into Roger's parents. I think the way his parents approached his growth is very interesting, especially since we studied Tiger in the last series. So Roger's parents were unbelievably hands off. They gave him a lot of control, but they provided guidelines where they thought were necessary. And this let Roger really take a ton of ownership over his tennis and his career, and it ended very well for him. Tiger's had a lot more hands-on approach by his parents, but it also ended up creating a successful athlete. Let's just look at Roger's parents and see what some of their philosophies were. At that stage, as agents, we talk much more with the parents than the player, Brunette said. And I can tell you Roger's parents were extraordinary. They were well educated and asked the right questions, and when they gave you their confidence, they gave it you all the way. If all the parents had been like them, it would have been a much better business. It's tough to be an agent because the grass is always greener elsewhere. So you're hearing from one of the early agents that worked with Roger how great his parents were to work with. This is a common theme throughout the story of Roger Federer. His parents seem to be able to be in the right place or not be there at the right times in order to have his career thrive. But what are the backgrounds of his parents? How did they create and cultivate an environment to raise a prodigal tennis player? So his mom was a tennis coach, not a serious tennis coach, but sort of a club tennis coach. And she also worked at a pharmaceutical company. And that's where she met Roger's dad. So Roger's mom was from South Africa. She was working in South Africa. Roger's dad was from Switzerland, and he was working in Switzerland at this pharmaceutical company. And there was benefits to that. So they had access to tennis courts. They had access to a lot of opportunities in tennis for the family as well as for Roger. I'll get a little bit more into the access to tennis in a little bit, but let's start with their approach and how hands-off they were. Of course, they came around when he had a match, but for the trainings, they were still working, so they would never show up or tell me what he has to do or how he has to play or how he has to practice. I had parents that thought their children were much better than they really were. You get those kinds of people, but I didn't have any trouble with the Federers. So they let the coaches do their jobs. They realized that they are tennis players, but they're not people that can really impart new advice. I see a lot of parents that are decent at a sport. You see golfers who are 10 handicap or something like that, and they try to show their kids what they should be doing. And it just sucks all the fun out of it for the kids because they're being told another thing that they're doing wrong by their parents. And also the parents aren't usually giving that good advice if they're just sort of a decent but not exceptional golfer or someone who hasn't studied the golf swing in an effective way. I was the Swiss German kid that everyone was making fun of, he said. I couldn't wait for the weekend when I could take the train back home to Basel. But the move to Ecoublanc was also a choice that he had made freely, leaving behind not only his parents and sister, but Coach Peter Carter, the old boys club, and his comfort zone in an attempt to take his tennis to another level. We wanted it to be Roger's decision, Lynette Federer told me. We were very much in the supporting role, and I think that was one of the biggest reasons he stayed with it and persevered, because it was his decision. So this was a big thing throughout Roger's career, is he had an incredible team. He had a great support network. He had his parents who cared for him and were willing to support his career. But he, at the end of the day, was making the decisions, and he alone was accountable to these things. We saw that him going to Ecoublanc in the first place, he didn't even tell his parents. And they found out, and they were okay with it. I don't know how many parents would be okay in this day and age with their kid deciding to go, for example, play professional tennis or to commit to a national team and them not being part of the direct conversation. That to me is pretty extraordinary, but that is building a tremendous amount of maturity and, again, accountability into what Roger's doing. On Sunday evenings, as Federer's parents drove him to the station in Basel to catch the train back to Ecoublanc, he would usually be in tears. If his parents had imposed Ecoublanc on him, there's a good chance he would have rebelled and refused to return. But since it had been his decision to attend, he stuck with it. His mother believes that much good came of her son's short-term struggles. Roger's time at Ecoublanc was a great lesson in life for him, that things don't always go your way and that you don't get anywhere in life with talent alone. And maybe this is something that's a function of who the kids are or who the athlete is, maybe Tiger wouldn't have done well with the ambiguity of trying to navigate his own life. He obviously struggled when his dad was less in the picture, and there was a lot less clear of a path for him on a day-to-day basis. Roger seems to be rebellious and sort of impish, and I forget who said it before, but you could steal cows with him, right? And being too hands-on might have squelched his fire and desire for tennis as well. So catering to individuals' needs and understanding who the kids are, what motivates them, and what is a detriment to them going forward is something that's really important. Clearly, Roger's parents understood him and knew him well. Robert believed in his son's talent, but he was only a recreational tennis player. He sought expert opinions. One of the fastest ways to blur and then damage the relationship between a parent and a child is for the mother or father to coach their tennis prodigy. That was never a serious issue for Robert and Lynette Federer. Almost every time Robert tried to pass on some tennis instruction, his son would not even look at him. Lynette, meanwhile, did not feel she had the patience for her son's desire to experiment, rather than stick with the confines of the tennis manuals. I kind of thought that this was funny. It seems like neither of them wanted anything to do with each other's tennis. And so they just let, Roger do his own thing. And it worked out in a really effective way. Again, this is part of knowing their kids and part of knowing what it takes to get to the next level. So Lynette, Roger's mom, had exposure to other tennis players. They were both seeking advice about how to make this work, and they realized that they were limited in what they could offer Roger. I'll also say that of all the tennis players in the big three that I know of, so Roger, Rafa, and Djokovic, none of them were coached by their direct parents. So Rafa was probably the closest. He was coached by his uncle, but that's different than having your direct parent be a coach for you. You even see, for example, and it might be different with the Serena sisters. I can't wait to study them, because we'll maybe be able to compare and contrast what having a more domineering parent figure in tennis does for a career. It could be a good thing. It could be a bad thing. That will be TBD. Though the Federers were not the types to deprive their son of dinner when he lost a match, they did feel compelled to act when he lost his cool. Federer tells the story of when his father had heard and seen enough during one of their hitting sessions. Robert expressed disapproval, placed a Swiss 5-franc coin on the bench, and told Roger that he could find his own way home. That was the message from my parents, and I feel like Mirka and me were very similar in that respect. All we're asking for is to just put in a good effort. So you see this across a lot of scientific research. You hear this on the Huberman podcast and plenty of the books that I've read. I'll link some research in the description and in the show notes. Rewarding results does not produce the type of qualities you want in kids. It makes success an extrinsic reward. And you want kids to be intrinsically motivated towards their sport, towards whatever they're pursuing. Once it feels like they're doing it to get the reward, then it generally becomes significantly less fun. This is one thing that happened to me when I was trying to play golf, is when I started playing and I was playing for money, and I realized that my livelihood or my financial livelihood was based on that, all of the fun was sucked out of it. If parents instead are rewarding kids for the hard work that they're putting in, they're telling them that, hey, this is paying off because of the effort you put in or the approach that you took, that increases or continues to feed the intrinsic motivation. To me, this is a huge observation, especially related to parenting, related to coaching. It's about rewarding the process, not rewarding the end goal, because it has the opposite effect of what you think it would. They also used very realistic milestones of support. Something that we described earlier is that Robert and Lynette, they didn't necessarily see their son as this crazy tennis prodigy. They were trying to take this strategically along the whole way. The most influential voices of reason at this stage belonged to his parents. Yes, they recognized that their son had considerable potential and had shown commitment to his game at Ecublon. But the Federers were also well aware by this stage that many promising juniors never reached the highest level. They wanted a backup plan. Robert Federer told Roger that they would help finance his career, but that if he was not in the top 100 by age 20, he would have to return to school and pursue a degree. I had no problem with that. No problem making that promise, Roger told me. I liked my chances, but I was also realistic. So, how do you balance the incredible belief that you have that you will reach number one or that you'll win major championships, that you can beat Pete Sampras or any of these things, with this direct realism of this is a career, there's finances involved. I won't be able to play for a certain, if I don't make a certain amount of money, if I don't get to a certain point in your career. And I really like how Roger's parents approached this. They essentially said, we'll give you this much rope. If you can live up to this potential at this point in time, you'll essentially be set free. If you can get into the top 100 in the world, you don't need money from us anymore necessarily. And let's think about how much more difficult this could have been in other ways. Either they would have given him free rein and said, hey, we'll fund your career no matter what. And that doesn't necessarily help Roger with the goals that he would set or give him some urgency to pursue this in a different way. Or they could have said, you have to get to top 10, top 15, top 20 in the world, which is likely unreasonable at that point. I think he did probably get to around top 10 in the world by the time he was 20. But still, I really like how the expectations from his parents were at the right level for Roger, not putting too much pressure on him, but also giving him a little extra motivation. Lynette and Robert said, hey, Roger, you have to want it. After all, he decided to come to Exponential. They didn't overwhelm him with too high expectations, but they didn't under-challenge him either. They gave him a certain framework within which he could move. And when they realized that he had exceptional skills, they put all their eggs in the tennis basket. So essentially reiterating what I just said, but it's giving a little bit more context into how they were viewing this, is that they believe in their son. As he gets better, their belief continues to grow, and they're willing to put more eggs in a basket, willing to wager more, willing to go further with that. There's this proving ground over time. It's not necessarily them being like, day one, like Tiger, he's going to change the entire world with golf. This is a bit more pragmatic and probably a little bit healthier approach overall. We were always having to manage our finances in order to fund Roger's career. Perhaps this is why he had a serious and frank talk with his son one day, in that manner in which only a father is capable. Roger was 15, and he was leaning towards a tennis career despite his great soccer talents. Robert gave him conditions for moving forward. I'm not going to finance you into your 30s just so you can roam around at 300th place in the rankings. Rotsky, that's what his parents called him, was sure that he would go much further than even his parents could imagine. Certainty was something he never lacked. Since he was a kid, he's always done what he wants. I would watch him at the children's and youth tournaments Robert calls. Like almost any father, Federer would get excitable and yell instructions and comments to his son. In vain, he never looked at me, ever. And that sort of summarizes Roger's approach, is that he's happy you're there, but he's in the moment, he's playing his own tennis game when he's on the court. I'll also say that the Federers, they did make a financial sacrifice. They had to go out on a limb to support Roger's career. Yes, they had reasonable incomes, they had reasonable jobs, but it was by no means the means that a professional athlete or a multimillionaire, billionaire would have to be able to support a career. And so there is sacrifice on the parents' sake as well. We saw this with Tiger as well, where there is sacrifice in the sense that there's a huge amount of time and research and effort that Earl Woods had to do to be able to give Tiger as many opportunities as possible. And fortunately for Roger, he was in a position where a lot of the resources were quickly available to him in terms of the Swiss Tennis Federation. And that brings me actually to his access to tennis. So something that was outside of Roger's control, that was a huge benefit to him, is he seemed to be in the right place at the right time when it came to his access to tennis. An athlete as well, Lynette trained young tennis players, worked with the Basel Tennis Tournament organization, and developed a preference for golf in her later years. There was a time between 2003 and 2005 in which Federer's parents managed their son's career, snatching that responsibility away from the powerful IMG. After just 2 years, control passed to Tony Gotzik, who ended up leaving IMG to start a whole new business with Federer, Team 8. 8 is the Swiss player's lucky number. So they're heavily involved in his career. it's a little bit funny. So, for example, Kobe, his parents were heavily involved early in his career. Tiger, his parents were heavily involved early in his career and were managing things. For Federer, they started off not being involved in his career. He had an agent. And then when he left his agent, Mirka and his parents took over. So he went almost the opposite direction, where a lot of players were going away from their parents when Federer went back to his parents to help him with these things. I think that that's an interesting observation. And it's also interesting in the relationship that he has with his parents, maybe compared to some of these other athletes. Lynette, deeply involved in the Basel tennis community, volunteered in the tournament's accreditation department. Her son soaked it all up, working as a ball boy for the first time in 1992, the same year in which he was presented an award during the tournament for being a promising sportsman in the region. Jimmy Connors and an Iranian player, Mansour Brahmi, exchanged a few shots with the young, bristle-haired Federer and posed for a photograph with him at the net. Federer was observing the life he would eventually lead, and the champions whose paths he crossed briefly in Basel as a boy later re-entered his orbit in a much more profound way. Edberg as a coach, and Fiera as his friend and occasional doubles partner. So, as we saw with Kobe and Tiger, they both had access to professionals and seeing professionals up close early on. Kobe saw his dad play professional basketball in Italy. Tiger is playing and practicing with professional golfers when he's 7 years old, 8 years old. And Federer here is able to rally and get inside access to these tournaments. He's able to see how these athletes are preparing at the highest level. We even saw Shane Battier. He was a ball boy for the Pistons. So there's a lot of access, a lot of things you're seeing, and being close to the sport at the highest level unlocks a lot of things. It either tells you, hey, maybe I don't have the ability or the skill or the work ethic to do what these people are doing. And on the other hand, maybe you realize that you're closer than you thought from a psychological perspective or even a physical perspective. Roger's mother worked for the tournament and, because she handed out the badges, had contact with the players. With her being South African as well, we immediately felt connected, Fiera said. We're friends for a bunch of years before Roger started doing well. So his mom is friends with professional tennis players. Think about the advantage that is compared to a normal kid who does not have that access as well. His first tennis racket was made of wood, which likely makes him the last great player to have started with one. He began at the age of 3 and soon began hitting against walls, garage doors, cabinets, and closets. So Roger is getting this early start, not quite as early as Tiger, but he has had a tennis racket or had been kicking a ball or had some sort of sporting equipment in his hand from a very early age. Born on August 8th, 1981, Federer was 3 years old when he swung a racket for the first time. By the time he was 4, he could play as many as 30 shots in a row without missing. An image from the Federer family album captures Roger as a young boy with a wooden racket on a clay court. Even then, he had excellent technique on the forehand. Federer's introduction to the game was at a private sports club in Basel, where membership was a perk for those, like his parents, who were employed by the pharmaceutical company Chiba. So again, that access to tennis early on is a huge benefit. We forget how important access is, and I cannot stress that enough. Somehow, it's good to hear how the greatest figure the sport has ever known worked on his game in the most cliched, commonplace way imaginable. He would spend entire afternoons hitting the ball against the garage wall or the kitchen cupboards of their home in the middle-class suburb of Munchesten. I can't pronounce that. As Federer has recalled, Mom got fed up because it was bang, bang, bang all day. Sometimes, when those games were inside, there would be breakages. When Federer was not playing tennis, he would often amuse himself by teasing his sister. Roger would always come around shouting, "I was with my friends," or he would pick up the receiver when I was on the phone. He was really a little devil. So that was his sister talking, describing him. And it seems like he had all this energy. He could either get into mischief or he could play tennis or he could hit a ball or do something along those lines. Federer began playing at his parents' club, which is owned by their employer Chiba and located in the suburb of Ashwil. He played on the red clay and sometimes with his mother and sister. They were only 20 months apart, so we could put them both on the court, Lynette Federer said in the documentary The Reunion. Once Roger picked up the racket, he was actually very talented, and he could hit the ball over the net very quickly, very easily, whereas Diana, she struggled a bit. So maybe there is some hints of natural talent in Roger compared to his sister, But I also think it's interesting to see that he's playing on red clay to start, and he obviously has a lot of success on clay, except when someone named Rafa Nadal is in the field. I'm jumping around a little bit. I apologize, but the last thing I wanted to note about access is that Roger was a ball boy and he fetched balls for Martina Hingis, who was the first Swiss player of either sex to win a Grand Slam singles title. We saw how Roger was able to gain confidence from other players. We looked at Mark Rossett. We also talked about Martina herself. But having that close access, being able to see someone who's done something incredible that you hope to achieve, you can feed off of their confidence in a very different way. And I thought that was really impressive. Now, I want to touch on some outside factors that led to his success beyond how he was raised by his parents, beyond the access to tennis and things along those lines. So, something that we talked about before was how easy it was for him to be liked and how much success he had in the media. One reason he was able to do that is because he was very much a global citizen. Geographically, he was in a region that spoke multiple languages, that was a melting pot of a lot of things. And he also had parents who were from different countries, even different continents, technically. And that helped him to understand and be open to embracing different cultures. It was Federer's natural state with a father from Switzerland and a mother from South Africa, where Federer first visited when he was 3 or 4 months old and then returned regularly throughout his childhood. Federer speaks French, English, German, and Swiss German, and also knows quite a few words of Afrikaans thanks to his mother, and quite a few swear words in Swedish thanks to former coach Peter Lundgren. So having access to language allows you to be open to culture. We said that in the last section on his reputation as well. As a Swiss in a border city of Basel, Federer was accustomed to switching cultural milieus from an early age. But being exposed to a way of life does not guarantee that you will embrace that way of life. Federer did so in part because for a tennis champion, there was a purpose to the globetrotting, and it was what made him genuinely giddy. We were very fortunate that we have a good system in Switzerland, Lynette said. If a child was talented, they were selected with the best of their age group and had good regional coaches. We were also lucky to have very good coaches in our local club. So those, again, are things that Roger probably couldn't control. Maybe those fall into a different bucket than the global citizen, but it is related to the region he is and the approach of Swiss tennis for preparing or identifying new talent. There's also good luck indeed that is involved. So the biggest strike of luck was Roger having access to early coaches, especially Peter Carter. Fortune indeed played a role for Federer. He might not have become a champion, at least not a tennis champion, if an Australian journeyman pro named Peter Carter had not decided to take a coaching job in, of all places, a small club in Basel, Switzerland. Federer might not have had the staying power if he had not met a cerebral, sensitive, and gifted fitness trainer named Pierre Paganini, or crossed paths with Mirka Vervanek, an older Swiss player who eventually became his part-time press agent, organizer-in-chief, and more importantly, his wife. There's no way he would have played on so long or so convincingly without her full support and her own ambition. But in life, certainty in pro tennis is really about what you do with your good fortune, what you make of your opportunities, and Federer built on many of them rather than squander them. I don't think I have to add too much to that, but the people that came into his life, there's absolutely a stroke of luck associated with that. How he cultivated those relationships and made them work is what I believe to be a skill of his own that he has in spades. The stopwatch started in earnest in Biel, a little more than an hour's drive south of Basel. As so often on and off the court, Federer's timing was excellent. The new House of Tennis belonged entirely to the Swiss Tennis Federation, unlike the center in Ecublom, where the federation had only been renting facilities and playing for court time in a private club. The move also allowed the federation to centralize, basing its coaching and administrative departments in the same place for the first time. So very close to where Federer is posting up, he has access to this incredible facility. This is, again, something that is a geographical advantage associated with him, and a stroke of luck that it would move right at this time in the peak of his tennis. Clay was Federer's original surface. He learned the game in Basel, playing outdoors in the warmer months and then indoors under the big heated bubbles that were inflated over the courts at clubs like Old Boys. It's very common in Switzerland to have indoor clay in the bubble, so the club can still keep running through the winter, Federer told me. So a lot of people talk about the advantage that European players have on clay because they're playing a lot more clay growing up. In the US and in some other countries, they have dramatically less access to clay. And to me, that's a pretty interesting thing, is we look at how many, for example, US players have won a French Open. It's very few in comparison to a US Open or some of these other tournaments. A lot of players, great American players, the only major championship they have not won is the French. And I think in terms of luck, this is my favorite way to end this mini section. There seemed to be a form of density involved. Agassi told us in the Players Lounge, a lot of people say it's better to be lucky than good. I'd rather be Roger than lucky. The guy has earned his place in the game and earned his title. Winning here was just something that would have been a bit of a crime if he never did. He's been the second best clay courter for 5 years running. And if it weren't for one kid from Mallorca, he would have won a handful of these things. So obviously that was on winning the French Open. And how Roger won his French Open is Nadal got knocked out early, and it wasn't a cakewalk into the finals, but the main obstacle that had knocked him out quite a few times previously was not there. And a lot of people believe that was a little bit of luck, but at the same time, you'd rather be consistently good and only losing to one guy. To me, that is not luck. It was an inevitability if something went a different way. The last area where there was some luck involved was in Ecublon, or this is another factor. So just to reiterate, Federer leaves home to essentially do intensive study in tennis and be educated in a tennis-specific environment. In Ecublons, Federer also developed his affinity for indoor tennis and fast playing conditions. The 4 indoor courts in Ecublon, which were the primary courts during the cooler months, were low bouncing and quick, lightning quick, Federer said. So if you're playing on faster courts, maybe your reaction times are improving, your game is evolving. We've seen in Brazil how Brazil had incredible soccer culture because they played a faster game, which is futsal. And that carried over to regular soccer, where since they're used to seeing a faster ball, now they can actually play soccer with a slower ball more effectively. It seems like they have more time. Maybe that is just a form of training that they're doing. And there's a chance that a little bit of that went into some of Roger's success. There's a lot of speculation in golf or in other sports like that the course you play growing up might have a large impact on how you perform at the higher levels. Whether the course is wide open or narrow or a lot of these other factors, if it's very scoreable or not very scoreable, these can shape your game of golf as you grow. So this is something we see in a lot of areas, how the environment that you're in when you're young can have a dramatic impact on the way you style your game, the way you're strategic about your game, and how it builds into everything that you create on whatever your field of play is. Before I get into the pitfalls of success, I just want to touch a little bit on Roger's demeanor and his approach and some of his attributes. This is related to how distractible he was, I guess. Roger had to play sports. If he wasn't moving around, he was unbearable. Federer was a very active child, close to hyperactive, Federer says, and grew up in a middle-class home on a quiet street in the Basel suburb of Münchenstein, where he showed far more passion for sports than for academics. This got me thinking, is there more instances of hyperactivity in athletes? Is that one of the reasons why some people are drawn to sports? Because it's a physical action, because you're able to release energy? This is, again, a really interesting question to me, especially as we look at other athletes. So Michael Phelps, as well as Simone Biles, have been vocal about having ADHD themselves. And there's implications for that in their sport and how they train. For example, Simone Biles in, I believe, Tokyo, she wasn't allowed to take the medication that was prescribed to her, and she didn't have necessarily the results that we would expect. This isn't about if that's a good or a bad thing. All it is to say is that there's different ways that people view the world. And I think it's interesting to think about if we're doing the people in our lives, the people we coach, or ourselves a favor in our approach based on how we all view the world. If we have ADHD, if we have other like different mental models for how we approach things, what can we do to maximize our capabilities with where we're at now? It was making so much noise that it was hard for everyone to concentrate, Fries said. Federer, an impulsive teenager with energy to burn, would heed the request, but not for long. He stopped for maybe 5 minutes, and then he got his racket and started again, Fries said. And I said, Roger, stop it now. He really could not sit still. So Roger is just bouncing a ball, annoying everyone else, but he couldn't stop. He was compulsive about moving and action and thinking about tennis. On the other hand, when something did interest him, he was very awake and focused. When he wasn't, he could shut down without a problem. Everything that had to do with a drill, grammar exercises, for example, bored him. But he was happy to contribute if you had to read a text or discuss a topic. Orally, he made rapid progress in French. He enjoyed expressing himself creatively, always picking up expressions and incorporating them. English, he spoke excellently anyway, thanks to his mother, so he was sometimes excused from lessons. Roger had an exceptional perception. He could process many things simultaneously. That also helped him as a tennis player. On the court, you must be aware of many things. Where's the ball? Where is the opponent? How is he moving? Where could he play? How is the ball rotating? Moreover, Federer's characteristic of completely switching off when it comes to these things that don't interest him has helped in his career. Then he doesn't waste any energy on it. That's an important lesson for his longevity. He is an energy artist. So we think about the downside of ADHD is distractibility. The upside of ADHD, from what I've learned, is hyperfocus. If there's something you truly enjoy, you get overly immersed and you tune everything out. And that's something, again, we see in a lot of athletes. I'm very curious as to how perhaps ADHD, perhaps flow states, perhaps focus and compartmentalization are all intertwined. I would imagine there's something related to that I will do my best to find and study more for you all. Now, the last section here is on the pitfalls to Roger's success. So Roger, again, if I was to be a professional athlete, I would love to emulate his career. It seems like he did incredibly well on the court. He played for a long time with relatively little injury, and he loved the lifestyle and the process. He was able to cultivate a great family environment even on the road. There's very little to criticize. I would say, though, that there's still probably ways that could be improved. Maybe by improving more, it would have made some of the rest of his journey less enjoyable. He's so well-rounded that I think that he probably got it pretty close to right, but I still think it's important for us to speculate about what maybe could have been done differently and what we could learn from that. So Roger did eventually get injured. That is something that is a fact. It took a very long time, but he did hurt his knee. Federer's luck did change. His back became a long-term concern, but it was his knees that truly betrayed him. He underwent his first surgery of any kind in 2016 after injuring his left knee in Melbourne when twisting or running a bath for his children. He underwent 2 surgeries on his right knee in 2020, and then perhaps most disappointingly, another elaborate knee surgery in August 2021 that cut his latest comeback short. I don't necessarily know if there's anything to learn from this, but I thought it was a little bit funny that, maybe not funny for us, sad for the athletes, that both Roger and Kobe injured their knees doing essentially household chores. It said that Kobe injured his knee vacuuming or injured his back. I can't remember which one. And Roger is injured and tore his meniscus running a bath for his kids. He was still not ready to retire and still wanted to give himself a glimmer of hope to return. But for all of his love of the game and his uber optimism, this was a new daunting territory. And that became even clearer after speaking with the knee surgeon I respect from Philadelphia. He had never treated Federer, but he knew the signs. Federer's previous surgeries and the extended recovery timeline in this instance meant that this was very likely not something straightforward like a meniscus tear, but instead arthritis and cartilage damage that would require regenerative techniques like microfractures, a downbeat scenario for a 40-something professional athlete. So something that none of us can run away from is Father Time, is age. And again, I think Roger did really well with age, but there's perhaps new technology, perhaps there's a different approach to rest that he hasn't experimented and tried with. Obviously, he seems to be retired now, but I did see him a couple days ago hitting and practicing on YouTube. So maybe there's another late Federer career stage that we'll see here. It's the age, let's be honest, he told me in an interview for the Times, going to be the very end of it. I don't see the point. I tried so long the last few years. That's fine, it's all good. When I did the surgery last year, I knew it was going to be a long road back. Of course, in my dream, I saw myself playing again, but I was very realistic about the comeback. Number one, I did it for my life, my personal life. I had to do a proper rehab. If I just retire, I know I'll not do my rehab correctly. So if I stay active and if I'm still a professional tennis player, I know I'll do it 100% right. And I keep the options open, hopefully to return to exhibition tennis at least 250s, 500s, thousands if things really go super well, and grand slams if magic happens. I know I said I was supposed to criticize Roger in this part or look at pitfalls, but to me, this is really incredible is that he knows himself well enough. He cares so much about his quality of life outside of tennis that he's using tennis as a motivating factor to make sure he gets to 100%. That to me does show a shift in priorities over time. Is tennis was the most important thing. But in this case, I'm using tennis to be able to get my body right so I can spend time with my family. I can hit with my kids. I can do all these different things. Tennis players fear a diagnosis of glandular fever or mononucleosis, and rightly so, as it can end careers. While the disease did not bring Federer's tennis career to a close, it did have a considerable effect on his fitness levels during 2008. That was the year he lost in the semifinals of the Australian Open to Djokovic, won just 4 games in the French Open final against Nadal, and when his 5 years of Wimbledon dominance came to an end with defeat in the final against the Spaniard. Federer has estimated that he lost as many as 20 training days to the disease, though he was unaware for a long time that he even had it. Had his doctors had known at the time, they would have advised strongly against playing the Australian Open. Compared to other players, he actually made it very well out of getting mononucleosis. There's a couple players that had to retire because of it, as I mentioned before. Again, I'm not sure that he could have done something necessarily different, but he did end up losing out on quite a few majors, including the one of the greatest matches in history with Nadal at Wimbledon in 2008. So I think that overall his injuries, I don't know if they could have been prevented in any different way, but this is an overarching lesson for us to be completely conscientious of these things, because I think when you're playing sports for a long period of time, injuries are inevitable. Is there even an extra gear that we can go to prevent these? With Roger, maybe the technology wasn't there. Maybe there's some of these other things. But I would imagine for everyone, there is still something additional that they could have been doing to mitigate the risk of injury. Outside of injury, what were some things that held Federer back? Federer possesses so much talent that he sometimes becomes blind and wants to win on his own terms. If you look at his career, it makes sense. But he made a mistake. He wanted to hurry the match with a spectacular serve, but it probably would have been better to lower the speed of the serve and change the angle to work against his rival's body. The fact is that Federer's serve ended up at an ideal height and a comfortable distance for Djokovic, who had only had to react instinctively, lightly adjust, and look for the hit. It's a shot that he tested a lot in training and that came out perfectly for the Serbian. His shouts and his euphoria lifted him at the same time that they sank Federer, who still asks himself today how he could have missed that opportunity. So Roger, because he is so skilled, as we saw early in his career, sometimes he looks for the artistry. Sometimes he tries to do too much rather than going for the high percentage play. This is the curse of talent, where you know you can do it, but you don't necessarily know if you should do it. He lost 24 tour singles matches after holding match point, while Nadal and Djokovic have lost fewer than 10 such matches. Maybe this is a function of him wanting to finish things in style rather than to finish things effectively. I think that there could be something to that. I know it's bad to say this, but sometimes I call Federer an underachiever in tennis, considering all the matches in big tournaments he lost being already up. The guy should be at 30 Grand Slam tournaments if you're talking about Del Potro, Djokovic, Nadal, and all these matches he lost where he was clearly ahead. So this is a trend for Roger, is that in the last set, in the tiebreak, he has lost probably more than he should. And maybe this is perfectionism, maybe this is something else. But I would be very interested into what Roger would say about why he underachieved in those certain areas. And this is what his coach says about that. I think it's because his style is so offensive, said Paul Annacone, his former coach. When he was younger and moved differently, he could get away with more. But now that he's older, he has to be more offensive against the great players. And that's tough to do in big pressure moments. Rafa, when he's nervous, he's got so much margin on every shot, and he's a great mover. Novak, even though his ball is so flat, he's so precise, and there's not a lot of risk in how he hits the ball. Roger, there's a lot more risk. So perhaps part of the beauty of Roger Federer is that there's a blade that cuts both ways. So he's more aggressive, so he has opportunities to win, but that aggressiveness can hold him back in certain scenarios. It was a totally different match because Roger is not used to being on such a small court, and the level dipped so much from center court to court one. I was very surprised how good he can be on center court, even though he's not playing doubles at all. He was, of course, the best player on the court. But once he played on court one, he felt like it was too small. He was telling me, it's too small. I don't have any rhythm on this court. So Roger has a huge benefit playing on center court because he's been there so much. He's used to this. He's a star, and other people, the size can be overwhelming. But when Roger later in his career is not playing on the center court and he's on these other courts, he's actually at a disadvantage. Again, this is a very small thing, but it's interesting to think about how our domain or what some of the advantages we have are and how we might lose them based on the stage in our career that we're at. So as you can imagine, I really enjoyed learning about Roger Federer. I maybe put a little too much content together for this, but to me, all of it was so useful when we think about greatness in sport. Roger is someone who, again, epitomized success in terms of championships and wins, success in terms of life balance and enjoyment of the game, and success in terms of family, as well as longevity. And he is an incredible case study for us to look at and now be able to compare against the other people that we've looked at before. In this section, we really covered how Roger's natural advantages came about, but how many of them I believe to be something that he or other athletes could be in larger control of, how his parents did a great job giving him freedom to love the game, how luck was a factor, but it's better to be Roger Federer than lucky, how ADHD or a different perspective view of the world based on brain chemistry might impact how we raise athletes or how we approach them in training. And then finally, some of the things that held Roger back from more success. Again, they weren't necessarily pitfalls of what he could have done better. They're more just inevitabilities of a career. Thank you again for listening. The next Anatomy of Excellence series is going to be on Michael Phelps. I've heard a lot of really interesting things about him. His coach has written a book, and he's also written 2 autobiographies, which I'm really excited to dive into. If you enjoyed this, if you found it useful, please leave a review. Please tell a friend, someone who's pursuing excellence in their craft. Let me know on the social media channels if you liked this, how I could improve, if there are books you would recommend, if there's articles or athletes you'd recommend me study. I will link all of my socials in the show notes. And until next time, let's pursue greatness together.